Welcome, gentle listener, to Sleepy Facts. This is a quiet place, a soft current in the deep of the night, where learning is a lullaby and curiosity is a dream. Here, stories of the cosmos unfold at the pace of your own breath, a gentle rhythm to carry you toward rest. Settle in and let the silence widen, making space for a story to begin. The world quiets down. The day's thoughts drift away like clouds, leaving behind the deep, calm canvas of the night sky. And there, holding its place in the stillness, is the moon. It is a constant presence, a silent keeper of time, a silver shore for our dreams. We look up at it and imagine the quiet, the stillness, the dust of ages resting undisturbed. But the silence is not empty. It holds stories of journeys taken of incredible precision and of a resilience that defies the deepest cold. Tonight, our thoughts drift upward, following a faint signal from that silent world, to listen to the story of a small craft that dreamed of touching the moon with impossible grace. A dream unfolds of a gentle arrival on a distant, silent shore. Earlier this year, the nation of Japan made history, not with a great roar, but with a quiet, perfect touch. It sent a spacecraft to the moon, joining a small, hushed circle of others who had reached that world before the United States, Russia, India, and China. But this was a different kind of arrival, a mission born from a dream of impossible precision. The craft achieved a landing so exact, so perfectly placed, it would be like standing in London and sending a single skin cell across the world to Cairo to have it land not just in the city, but upon one specific chosen grain of rice. It was this quiet, breathtaking ambition that held the world in a state of wonder. As the craft made its long, silent journey, the world spoke of its engineering, its incredible aim. Once it had touched down, the stories on Earth shifted. It was given a name, a soft and fitting title for its stealthy grace, Moon Sniper. The heart of its mission was simply to show that such a thing was possible, to demonstrate how precisely we could now arrive on another world. And so this tiny spacecraft, not much larger than a passenger car, was not built to endure. It was not designed to survive the long, deep cold of a lunar night. And yet, somehow, it did. It has survived not one, but three. A silent sleeping thing that kept waking up, baffling the scientists who watched from a world away. This resilient craft, against all odds, would stir from its slumber again and again, sending back faint signals and quiet, ghostly images from the lunar surface. A small, persistent whisper of life in the great silence. And in a final curious detail, it rests there now upside down. This is the story of the smart lander for investigating moon, also known as Slim. Its journey and its unexpected life began with a clear purpose. Its mission was to travel to a place near the Scioli crater, some 200 miles south of the Sea of Tranquility, where humanity first took its famous small step. There, on ground thrown outward by an ancient impact, it was to analyze the composition of olivine rocks. By landing there, researchers hoped to study the deep heart of the moon without ever having to drill to read the story of the moon's origins in the stones that lay waiting on the surface. To help in its work, Slim carried two even smaller companions, the lunar excursion vehicles. These tiny rovers were designed to be released from the main craft to move across the dust and gather their own pictures, their own small pieces of the story. But beyond the science, beyond the study of ancient stones, Slim was a demonstration. It was a promise of a new way to explore. It aimed to show how a small light explorer could land with pinpoint accuracy even in treacherous rocky places that were too dangerous for the larger craft of the past. If it succeeded, it would change everything. It would allow us to study the moon and other worlds with a lighter, more nimble, and more focused touch. To understand the weight of this quiet achievement, it helps to let our thoughts drift back in time to the early days of lunar exploration. Reaching the moon has never been simple. Landing on its surface is a delicate, difficult dance. Of all the attempts made throughout history, only about 43% have been successful. The early missions faced immense challenges limited by the technology of their time. The Soviet Union made a dozen attempts before its craft. Luna 9 finally touched down safely. NASA's Ranger series took 6 tries before one succeeded. The moon has no atmosphere, no cushion of air to slow a craft's descent. Landers must rely only on the precise thrust of their engines, fighting against gravity with no room for error. To land safely, a craft must come to a near zero speed. Just as it touches the surface, a maneuver of incredible difficulty to ensure that none of the delicate instruments on board are damaged by the impact. Every single Apollo mission, those celebrated journeys of human exploration, landed dangerously close to rocks' crater rims or steep slopes that could have ended the mission in an instant. The astronauts had only a few moments and a very limited ability to make adjustments in real time. They also landed in the safest places imaginable, on the near side of the moon close to the equator, and in conditions of almost perfect light. This made the landing itself less perilous, but it meant that our exploration was always limited to the same small patch of lunar ground. We were visiting the moon, but only ever seeing its safest, most familiar shores. The dream then was to create a craft that could land anywhere. that could be sent to a very specific place to explore a particular feature. Scientists imagined being able to study different kinds of rock, different soils, without needing a rover to travel for miles and miles. This would make missions simpler, less expensive, and would open up whole new regions of the moon that had remained forever out of reach. The Moon Sniper mission cost $120 million. To feel the meaning of that number, we can look back to the Apollo era. The 4 lunar rovers built for the later Apollo missions cost $38 million back in Med2, which in today's terms would be nearly $300 million. More recent rovers from China and India cost well over $100 million each. SLIM was a demonstration of a lighter, more economical way forward. This journey toward precision has been a long and patient one. In the world of space exploration, there is a term called the landing ellipse. It is the area of uncertainty, the wide space where a spacecraft is expected to land. Back in the '69, for Apollo 11, that ellipse was enormous, a stretch of land 18.5 kilometers long and 4.5 kilometers wide. By 2013, China's Chang'e 3 mission had narrowed that space to a square of 6 kilometers by 6 kilometers. And then, in January of 2024, Japan's lander arrived, touching down just 55 meters from the center of its target, a target zone only 100 meters by 100 meters. It was a landing ellipse more than 8,000 times smaller than the one given to Apollo 11. The secret to this incredible accuracy was a system of vision-based navigation, a technology that JAXA, the Japanese space agency, calls smart eyes. As SLIM descended toward the lunar surface, it was constantly capturing images of the ground below. In real time, it compared these images to orbital maps created by other explorers that came before it from NASA, India, and Japan. By matching what it saw to these detailed maps, the spacecraft knew exactly where it was moment by moment. It could process the images as they arrived, adjusting its own path on the fly, steering itself with gentle, precise bursts from its thrusters, guiding itself toward that tiny chosen spot. The craft itself was remarkably light, weighing only 200 kilograms without its fuel. A successful landing would prove that small, lightweight craft could achieve great and complex things. Except the landing was not quite perfect. JAXA managed to place the craft exactly on target, a stunning success of navigation. But in the final moments, it toppled over. After such a perfect approach, a flawless descent from orbit, something went wrong. The journey had begun on the 6th of September, 2023. SLIM arrived in lunar orbit on Christmas Day, a silent ornament in the dark. And on January 18th, 2024, it began its final approach. As the world watched the live stream, one mission team member described the 20 minutes of descent as a breathless, numbing period of terror. And as the craft lowered itself toward the surface, just 50 meters from the ground, one of its two main engine nozzles mysteriously broke away. With its thrust suddenly off-center, the craft began to move sideways. It tried to correct itself, firing its smaller thrusters to regain its balance. But it was not enough. The incredible thing is that even in this moment of crisis, Slim's intelligence, its smart eyes kept working. It recognized the anomaly in its own descent, and in the few seconds it had left, it found a safe spot to touch down, avoiding a catastrophic crash. It came to rest softly, but it tipped over, coming to a halt on its nose. The images, sent back by one of the tiny rovers it had released just before landing, showed the scene clearly. The box-shaped lander was resting on the gray dust upside down. Its solar panels, designed to catch the light of the sun, were pointing away toward the cold ground instead of up toward the sky. Without sunlight, it was only a matter of time before its batteries would fade. And so shortly after its awkward arrival, after sending back one last mosaic of images of its new home, the craft fell silent. With just 12% of its power remaining, the team on Earth made the decision to switch it off, holding on to a faint hope that when the sun's angle changed in the sky, a little light might reach its panels and it could perhaps be woken up again. And just 10 days later, on the 29th of January, that is exactly what happened. For 2 short days, Slim was able to power on, drawing in a trickle of energy from the sun, which had now moved across the lunar sky. But the relief for the team was brief. They knew the long lunar night was coming, a period of darkness and deep cold that would likely be the end for their small revolutionary craft. The lunar night is a challenge for any machine. For 14 Earth days, the moon's surface is plunged into total darkness, and the temperatures drop to an average of minus 180 degrees Celsius. This is followed by 14 days of searing heat, where the surface can reach 121 degrees. With no atmosphere to hold on to warmth, the temperature swing is extreme and brutal. Slim was never designed to survive this. And so on the 31st of January, the mission team put it back into hibernation, not expecting to ever hear from it again. But just in case, they decided they would try to listen for a signal after the long night had passed and the sun rose once more on that quiet part of the moon. On the 26th of February, with very little expectation, the team sent a signal into the dark, calling out to their small sleeping craft. And to their shock and their immeasurable joy, a signal came back. Their miracle moon sniper had survived. It had woken from the deep cold of its first lunar night. It began once again to send pictures back to Earth. The story impossibly did not end there. After 2 more weeks of gathering data during its second lunar day, the team once again set Slim to hibernate as another long night approached. To survive one lunar night was a miracle. No one expected it to survive a second, but somehow it did. On the 21st of March, the team confirmed they had once again received a signal. The pattern continued. In late April, more pictures arrived following its third lunar night. Slim had completely defied the odds, its electronics somehow surviving the intense swings of heat and cold that should have destroyed them. And in the images it sent back were pictures of the rocks around it. Pictures that will help researchers understand the moon's geology. In one image, a close-up of a rock they named Toy Poodle, a special camera was able to see the different minerals that made up the stone, offering clues to how the moon itself was formed. The little craft kept working, kept sending its quiet reports from a world away. A testament to a journey that was both a perfect success and a gentle failure all at once. Its tilted posture, a reminder of the universe's unpredictability, and its continued life, a whisper of its quiet strength. After the fourth lunar night, the team tried once more to make contact. But this time, there was only silence. It is likely that the small craft, after all its heroic efforts, has finally fallen quiet for good. But its mission was already a breakthrough. It demonstrated that these pinpoint landings are possible, opening a door to countless new futures. Scientists now dream of sending similar craft to the South Pole, Aitken Basin, a place where the moon's mantle, its deep interior, is thought to be exposed on the surface. And as NASA plans its own return to the moon with its Artemis missions, the kind of precision touchdown that the moon sniper achieved may be the only way to reach the water ice that lies hidden in permanently shadowed craters regions that have until now been completely inaccessible. This small overturned craft stands as a testament to how far we have come, a quiet glimpse into what the second lunar era may hold. But not all stories of return end in this way. There is another tale of another craft born from a very different dream. It reminds us to be careful what we call our space missions, for a name can sometimes hold a shadow of what is to come. When Russia named its first mission to the moon in 47 years, it was first called Lunar Globe, which translates to lunar sphere. But this name troubled one of the lead scientists, because the word glob in Russian is uncomfortably close to the word grob, which means coffin. And so the name was changed to Luna 20, a name that looked back to the legacy of the old Soviet lunar missions, the last time a Russian spacecraft had landed safely on the moon. Perhaps, though it was too late. Perhaps a shadow of that original name lingered around the mission, because we now know that lunar coffin would have been a more fitting name for the ill-fated Lunar 25. This mission was born not of a desire for precision, but from the echoes of an old rivalry, a race against time and a need to prove that a nation was still a great power. We often look to the missions of NASA or the European Space Agency, but Russia's space program has a long and powerful history. When it was part of the USSR, it was the Soviet Union's launch of Sputnik 1, the first artificial satellite that began the space race in 1957. For a time, the Soviet space program seemed unstoppable. It was the Soviet Union that put the first man in space, and the first woman, the first multi-person crew, the first living creature. Their rockets were the first to escape the Earth-Moon system, the first to impact the Moon, the first to orbit it, and the first to take pictures of its far side. Soviet cosmonauts performed the first spacewalk. The USSR launched the first space station. In the eyes of the world and to the great pride of its leaders, the Soviet Union was winning. But beneath this surface of success, the story was more complex. The Soviet Union also saw the first death during a space mission, when a cosmonaut's re-entry capsule parachute failed to open. The only 3 humans to have died in space itself were a Soviet crew. Their launches were often plagued with failures, but eager to maintain its image, the USSR simply did not report them. Any mission that failed to leave the atmosphere was pretended to have never been a moon mission at all. In truth, only about a third of Soviet moon missions were successful compared to America's 60% success rate. And so, when America landed the first humans on the moon in '69, a crowning achievement in the eyes of the world, both superpowers seemed to lose interest in the race. The fire of competition had cooled. The Soviet Union, having never sent its own cosmonauts to the lunar surface, quietly cancelled its plans to do so. The endeavor was seen as too expensive, and perhaps more importantly, what was the point of going if you were only going to be second? The silence widens and a new era begins to stir. With the turn of the new millennium and after the Soviet Union had dissolved in 1991, the world's gaze slowly began to turn back toward the moon. A new generation of scientists realized that our silent neighbor was not just a destination, but a stepping stone. They found evidence of plentiful resources like newly discovered water ice hidden in the shadows of its craters, ice that could one day provide rocket fuel, breathable air, and water for human missions to Mars. The moon began to attract the attention of businesses who saw economic potential in its resources. Nations began to consider the idea of permanent bases on its surface, not just for science, but as a way to turn a profit. And of course, there was still so much to learn, so many secrets held in its ancient dust. waiting for those who wished to understand how it was formed and the deep, slow cycles that govern it. Russia's old rival, the United States, began to dust off its old space programs. In 2005, America started its Constellation program, declaring its aim to go back to the moon. But now, other nations were joining the quiet return. India, which had not been a part of that first great race, began its own Chandrayaan program for lunar exploration in the year 2000. Governments across the world began to feel that the benefits of returning to the moon were so great that any nation that did not go would be left behind. In the words of one scientist, it was not a question of whether they could afford it, but whether they could afford to ignore it. Russia did not intend to be left behind. It was eager to pick up the fallen legacy of Soviet space exploration. In fact, it had begun thinking about a new lunar mission as early as the mid-1990s, when scientists put forward their proposals to Roscosmos, Russia's newly formed space agency. Their mission, the one first called Lunar Globe, was approved. In its original form, it was a grander plan with more parts: a penetrator to listen for moonquakes, a lander, and an orbiter. But the project did not have enough political will behind it. It faced deep budget cuts after the Russian financial crisis of 1998, when the nation's currency lost more than 2/3 of its value in just 3 weeks. The mission became mired in delays that pushed it back again and again. The penetrator and the orbiter were scrapped, leaving only the lander as the plan was reshaped to be more economical. Russia wanted to be seen as a great player in the space game, but it did not want to spend a massive part of its budget to do so. In 2005, Russia invested about $700 million in its space industry. For comparison, the United States invested over $15 billion. One way to work around this was to collaborate with other nations. Russia initially tried to work with India on its Chandrayaan-2 mission in 2007. The plan was for Luna 25 to be the mission's lander, flying alongside India's orbiter. But this low spending ultimately came back to haunt them. Russian scientists were unable to get the lander's technology working in time for the planned 2013 launch. Eventually, India abandoned the collaboration and completed the mission on its own. Russia was left trying to get Luna 25 to the moon's surface by itself. India's Chandrayaan-2 lander crashed into the moon. But India was determined to try again with a new mission, Chandrayaan-3. And so the two nations, once collaborators, were now set on a course as competitors. Both Russia and India were interested in the same destination: the moon's south pole, where the presence of water ice had been confirmed. Luna 25 and Chandrayaan-3 were now in a quiet race to be the first to touch down there, the first to perhaps discover that water ice in person. But Russia now faced a new and profound problem. The invasion of Ukraine in 2022 led to massive international sanctions. This was not only painful economically. A vital part of these sanctions was a ban on the trade of high-end computer chips and components. These were intended to prevent Russia from developing high-precision military rockets, but they hit Russia's lunar goals as well. European scientists began to end their collaborations with Roscosmos. In a world where Russia had once traded for many of its high-end components, it would now have to go it alone. India completed its Chandrayaan-3 craft and launched it on the 14th of July 2023. The road it took to the moon was slow, designed to be fuel efficient, but it meant the journey would take over a month. India estimated a touchdown on the 23rd of August, and this created a window of opportunity. If Russia hurried, it could complete its lander and arrive before India by taking a shorter, more direct, and more fuel-intensive route using its powerful Soyuz rocket. The Luna 25 mission, already delayed for years, had a final stroke of bad luck. Its navigation sensor, a critical piece of hardware, failed its quality tests. This was a serious problem because this sensor relied on a computer chip that was normally supplied from the West, a chip that Russia could no longer buy. So Russian scientists had to develop a new one on their own. The new sensor was named Bias-L. With this new component, Luna 25 was cleared for launch on the 11th of August 2023. It carried 8 Russian scientific instruments, including spectrometers to analyze the soil cameras to image the surface, and a device to measure the fine lunar dust. The plan was for Luna 25 to operate on the moon's surface for a full year, enduring the freezing cold of the lunar night and the intense radiation of the day. It had the potential to do good, solid science. The Soyuz rocket was powerful enough to get Luna 25 to the moon's surface by August 21st, 2 crucial days before India's lander was scheduled to arrive. Russia would, it seemed, win the race. Luna 25 launched successfully from the Vostochny Cosmodrome on the 11th of August. It entered the moon's orbit on August 16th. It took photographs of the surface imaging, the Zeeman crater on the far side. All systems were functioning normally. Communications were good. Russian scientists began to make the final preparations for the landing itself. The south pole of the moon is a treacherous place full of shadows and craters, and the scientists wanted a soft touchdown to protect the craft. But then something went wrong. On August 19th, Luna 25 lost communication with Earth. With no guidance from the ground, the craft attempted to perform its own pre-planned maneuver, a burn of its engine that would take it from a circular orbit around the moon into a new, lower path. The final ellipse before its descent to the surface. But a failure occurred. The Bias-L navigation device, the one developed by Russian scientists after the sanctions had sent bad information to the ship's control unit. As a result, the thrusters fired for 127 seconds instead of the intended 84. The longer burn pushed Luna 25 into a steeper and steeper descent. On the 20th of August, the craft was screaming down toward the moon's surface, moving too fast to stop. The scientists at Roscosmos could do nothing but watch the telemetry in horror as the lander hurtled toward the terrain, its speed growing faster and faster. Although no camera witnessed the impact, it is easy to imagine the grim, silent result of that acceleration. The moment that Luna 25 turned back into a lunar coffin. Its mission had not lasted a year. It had lasted only a few days. NASA's Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter later did a flyby of the area, taking an image of the craft's final resting place. Luna 25 had impacted with such force that it created a new crater about 10 meters in diameter. Russia had attempted to show the world that it was still a great power in space. But the mission had been mired in pressures and challenges. The Western sanctions had, in a way, indirectly sabotaged it. The Russian replacement chip was either not precise enough or not strong enough to survive the high radiation environment of space. But Russia's attempt to beat its rival India had also created problems for itself. This race, this need to arrive 2 days earlier, was a familiar echo of the past. It was reminiscent of a time in 1969 when the Soviet Union's Luna 15 mission crashed into the moon, only a few hundred miles from where the Apollo 11 astronauts were taking their first steps. Luna 15 had also been tasked with collecting moon rocks. It was an unmanned mission, but if America's landing had failed, it would have been a great point of pride for the Soviet Union that its robotic craft had succeeded. It was about political points. The Soviet Union didn't just want to get to the moon, it wanted to get there first. And when you are racing to beat someone, you take less time to make sure everything works as it should. You run a greater risk of failure. And so, just like with Lunavat Russia's Luna 25 had the opposite effect of what its leaders had intended. Rather than show Russia's superiority, it showed the downsides of isolation and rivalry. The cost of choosing competition over collaboration. If Russia had still been working with other space agencies, sharing in technological advances, perhaps it would be celebrating a success right now. In many ways, it is a tragedy. Perhaps this can one day change. The future of humanity seems pointed toward the stars. If we are to thrive out there, it will be because we as a world learn to work together. The sad fate of the Luna 25 mission can and should be a learning experience, not just an embarrassing footnote in history. but only if the right lessons are drawn from it. Pride is not always a good thing. Rivalry can leave us isolated when we don't need to be, and it can prevent us from thinking things through. It would be a quiet, beautiful thing if our efforts to prove our superiority to each other could finally be put to rest, buried in a frozen coffin on the lunar surface. The moon itself, of course, is indifferent to our struggles, our rivalries, our triumphs, and our failures. It continues on its ancient steady path, a silent, natural satellite orbiting our world. It has been studied for thousands of years, its regular motions used to mark the passage of time. Its dependable rhythms helped ancient civilizations know when to plant their crops. Its waxing and waning face cemented its place deep in the heart of symbol and tradition. It is a wonder, a necessity, and sometimes a curse. For while the moon's desolate beauty has captured the vision of poets, it also brings a desolation of its own. There is one lunar rhythm that is not so helpful to us, a 19-year cycle that brings unexpected floods and ruin. And NASA scientists are worried that in the middle of the 2030s, this cycle is about to hit its hardest yet. For ecosystems that are adapted to it, this won't be a problem. But the quiet question lingers in the air. How adapted are we? The moon is an inescapable part of life on Earth. Its cycles influence our wildlife, affect our climate, and create the tides. We tend to imagine the moon and the Earth circling each other in a stable, synchronized harmony. But as is so often the case, nature is not so simple. Every 6 years, the moon's orbit undergoes a subtle revolution, a slow shift in its alignment that causes high tides to grow even higher, tipping the world over the edge into dangerous flood territory. This subtle revolution has a name: the lunar nodal cycle. The name refers to a specific feature of the moon's orbit. We know that every 29.5 days, the moon circles the Earth. But this orbit is not flat. There is a 5-degree difference between the angle of the moon's orbit and the ecliptic plane, the flat plane on which the Earth orbits the sun. For half of the month, the moon is slightly above this plane. For the other half, it drops slightly below it. This means that there are 2 crossover points or nodes, an ascending node and a descending node, that mark the point where the moon's path crosses from one side to the other. And it is these nodes that move slowly, rotating around the planet over the course of that 18.6-year cycle. The movement itself is what creates the problem. To understand why our thoughts drift to the great silent forces that shape our world, we can feel in our imagination the steady pull of the moon's gravity on the Earth's oceans. It is a quiet, constant tug that causes the water to bulge outward on the side of the planet closest to it. This is what we call high tide. And we know too that another high tide happens on the side of the planet furthest away from the moon. This second bulge is not caused by a pull, but by a kind of release. It is the result of centrifugal forces as the Earth and Moon engage in a slow gravitational dance. They are like two dancers holding each other by the arms, spinning across a vast dark floor. And while it is mostly the smaller dancer, the Moon, that moves the Earth, being much more massive, is also swung around a little. And the water on its far side is trying to fling off into space, creating the second high tide. The Sun also has a role to play in this gentle cosmic tug of war, though its influence is smaller. It is a much greater mass which would create a much stronger pull. But its immense distance means that its effect on our tides is only about 1/3 as strong as the Moon's. When the Moon and the Sun are aligned, their gravitational pulls work together, creating extra-large tides that we call spring tides. This happens 6 to 8 times a year. When they are not aligned, their forces partially cancel each other out, causing smaller tidal extremes known as neap tides. And now we can bring our thoughts back to those lunar nodes, those invisible points where the Moon's tilted orbit crosses the flat plane of our own. During the spring tides, when the pull of the Sun and Moon work in unison, the risk of floods is already at its highest. But the Sun and the Moon are never more perfectly aligned than they are at a node. During one half of that 6-year cycle, the nodes are aligned in a way that suppresses the tides. The Sun and Moon are not quite tugging in the same direction, and so the tides are more temperate. But during the other half of the cycle, the nodes align in a way that amplifies the tides. And it is then that things become more serious, and the risk of floods becomes greatest. The last time this alignment occurred was in September of 2015. In the months leading up to it, both the United Kingdom and the United States issued major flood warnings to their citizens. The September tides themselves caused some minor flooding, but it was only when heavy rains combined with the strength of the lunar nodes a couple of months later that the real damage was done. In the United States in October, South Carolina saw flash flooding that caused property damage, with people having to be rescued by emergency services. At the end of December of that year, the United Kingdom was hit by some of the worst floods it had seen in a century. Combined with the power of a great storm, the flooding and storm damage cost an estimated £1.3 billion. These floods can be highly damaging. But that alone does not fully explain NASA's quiet concern for the upcoming alignment in the mid-2030s. There is another element at play, an extra layer of weight beyond the regular rhythm of this rising flood risk. Unfortunately, the next time the nodes align with the sun, it promises to be particularly devastating. The danger is that this natural phenomenon will be combined with an already strained system, a system even more strained than it was in 2015. The slow, steady warming of our planet has resulted in steadily rising sea levels. And when the next nodal alignment occurs, this will likely lead to a dramatic increase of floods all across the planet. A new study led by NASA's Sea Level Change Team predicts that almost all of the United States coastlines, along with Hawaii and Guam, will see a huge leap in the number of floods. Some predictions claim this alignment could cause 4 times the amount of flooding from one decade to the next. This will damage infrastructure and change our coastlines around the world. Human life will inevitably be affected. These floods will impact our shelter, our access to clean water and electricity, and they will increase the risk of waterborne disease outbreaks. The receding floodwater can create stagnant pools where mosquitoes gather, spreading other diseases like malaria. This has a quiet knock-on effect on the economy. These natural events can make coastal life unaffordable, with the increased cost of insurance on homes or an inability to find insurance at all. This could cause a slow reduction in the value of entire communities. This lunar cycle will damage the quality of life in coastal communities, where infrastructure may not be rebuilt or adapted to this new force of nature. And it is not just bad for humans. The peak of this lunar wobble, where high tides are at their highest, can drown the delicate ecosystems of salt marshes. These marshes are a habitat for a vast range of species, and these floods can cause these small creatures to drown. This means that other species like fish and seabirds who rely on them for food also suffer. And they are not the only ones who rely on the salt marshes. These ecosystems hold a multitude of marine life, including 75% of all fishery species. This means that the lunar wobble impacts the food chains of both humans and animals, causing deep disturbances to their natural habitats. And yet, even in this story of rising waters and potential devastation, it is interesting to note that not all ecosystems on the planet are negatively affected. Ecologists have found that this same lunar cycle has a powerful impact on the expansion and contraction of mangrove forests across most of the Australian continent. Their analysis showed that the peaks of the lunar nodal cycle, the times of the highest tides, coincided with the expansion of the mangrove canopy. When the lunar wobble is at its minimum phase, it causes the mangrove ecosystems to become very dry, which leads to a thinner canopy. But when the lunar wobble is at its maximum, the mangrove cover increases. Mangrove canopies are deeply beneficial to the Earth's environment. They are complex ecosystems that fight against climate change, protect wildlife, and shield coastlines. They can absorb 4 times as much carbon dioxide as rainforests of the same size. Their growth is vital to the welfare of our planet. So it is not all downside. Still, it is clear that if we do not plan ahead, our coastal cities and environments will face a serious crisis. The important question then is, what can we do about it? One method is better protection. As we have seen, the protection and restoration of mangroves can act as a shield against flooding. They can lessen the vulnerability of communities on the coastlines. More specifically, mangroves can avert damage by decreasing the height and the energy of the waves that pass through them. Their tangled above-ground roots and branches diminish the height of the waves, and so the waves lose their energy, stopping them from rushing onto the shore and carrying away the soil. The mangroves also reduce the energy of the wind, which can stop the formation of large waves in the first place. A densely packed mangrove forest can cut the height of a wave in half over just 100 meters. Another possible solution is to learn how to live with these flood-heavy conditions, to work with nature rather than against it. We can look to the flood defenses in the Netherlands, where 1/3 of the country is below sea level and another third is at risk of flooding. They have built an infrastructure that works with water that manages the rising sea levels. They have designed facilities called polders, which are pieces of land below sea level that have been reclaimed from the water. They are surrounded by an embankment to keep the water out, and they offer a network of drainage canals and pumps to manage the water levels, disposing of excess water by running it back to the sea or a river. This shows that there are ways in which we can observe nature and live alongside it. So the difficult news is that behind its ethereal beauty, our moon hides a power that, when combined with our own changing world, is set to overwhelm our coastal settlements. But there is always a bit of good news too. Knowledge is a power of its own. By understanding our plight, we can look for solutions, both among ideas that already exist and in new ways forward that have yet to be discovered. If we are to live with what is coming, it is time for us to use our innate creativity and our drive to adapt and survive to work with our planet rather than against it. On the 4th of March 2022, a mysterious object, a rocket booster, crashed into the surface of the moon. This event was watched by the scientific community, which had been tracking the booster since 2013 as it silently orbited our planet. When it crashed, it formed a strange double crater that defied any obvious explanation. But other watchers were more curious about its origin. Who had launched it? No nation claimed it. The mind is immediately caught up in ideas of secret government programs or shady corporations launching pirate satellites for a quick profit. But as we delve into it, the origins of this mystery rocket open our eyes to an unexpected issue, one that is deeply troubling. It speaks of an era fast approaching where space, rather than being a place of peaceful exploration, might become rife with danger and conflict. Hopefully, this is something that can be avoided. But the first step is to understand what is happening up there. To begin with, figuring out the origins of the rocket booster known as WEO 13A is actually one of the simpler aspects of this mystery. And no, it is likely not from a secret government program. While it is true, we do not have insider knowledge about the classified space programs of all the nations of the world. It turns out that secret space launches are surprisingly difficult to achieve. This is because for the last 70 years, after the invention of the intercontinental ballistic missile, countries have become very invested in knowing when other countries are launching rockets. The great fear during the Cold War was that America and Russia would send nuclear missiles at each other. As such, it was a matter of survival for each to know what the other was doing. They did this with radar and with spy networks. When Russia launched Sputnik 1 in 1957, American intelligence already knew about it. But since then, radar systems and satellites have become so good, they are able to spot launches within minutes. It is essentially impossible now to send a rocket up without someone noticing. Rockets are, after all, quite difficult to hide. And even if you did manage to launch it undetected, space is incredibly open. Amateur astronomers across the globe watch the skies as a hobby. It would not take very long before someone spotted it. You would likely have more success disguising your secret spacecraft as something it was not, sending it up disguised as an innocent satellite, or letting it fall off a rocket as if it were simple space junk. But we likely know the true origin of this mystery rocket thanks to a little bit of mathematics. Independent astronomers as far back as 2015 had watched the path of this rocket. And by plotting its course, they were able to calculate the reverse of its trajectory. By doing so, they could work out which nations it had passed over at various points in its past. Initially, this led them to believe that it was a stage of a SpaceX rocket. But this theory was later replaced by a much more probable explanation that it had belonged to the Chinese Chang'e 5T1 mission. The mystery rocket's orbit passed over China on the same day as that launch, and it matched its trajectory exceptionally well. There was more evidence. Students at the University of Arizona used a telescope to take a spectroscopic survey of the rocket. Essentially, by looking at the light reflecting off it, they were able to evaluate the type of paint used on its surface. And by comparing this to existing records, they identified that it was a much closer match to China's style of rocket than to SpaceX's. These cooperating pieces of evidence led one astronomer to claim a 90% certainty that the mystery rocket had belonged to China. But China denied it. When asked by journalists, a foreign ministry spokesman said that the upper stage of that mission had fallen through the Earth's atmosphere in a safe manner and burned up completely. He added that China's aerospace endeavors are always in keeping with international law. Some astronomers believe China was innocently mistaken. It is also possible that China was not telling the truth. But if the evidence is so strong, why deny it? It is perhaps that last line that offers the vital clue. China does not want to be seen as in breach of international law. And this is where a quiet sense of annoyance begins to arise. Not necessarily with China, but with a problem that is worldwide. You might not be aware of international space law. It does exist, although it is a little patchy. It is made up of a number of treaties that various countries have signed over the years, such as the Rescue Agreement, which highlights a nation's responsibility to help astronauts in distress, or the Outer Space Treaty of 1967, which enshrines in law the right of all nations to explore space. It makes states responsible for all space-related activities of their citizens and maintains that objects like the moon should only be used for peaceful purposes. It is the treaty that forbids any nation from placing nuclear weapons in space. It makes states liable for damages that they cause and requires them to avoid harmful contamination of celestial objects. It is likely this last article that China was trying not to run afoul of. While there was likely little harm done by the rocket crashing into the moon, it is not a good look to accidentally lose track of your rocket stages and have them crash into things later. If any bacteria were on the rocket, that could cause contamination. Even worse, if the rocket part had crashed into a satellite, or if one day there are lunar bases on the moon and the rocket had hit one of those, then it would have meant China had broken international law. The thought widens, becoming air. But the quiet unease that this mystery rocket leaves behind comes not just from a single nation trying to hide a small mistake. It comes from the silence where a law should be a framework of rules so full of quiet spaces and ambiguities that a rocket's origin could ever be a mystery in the first place. The international laws that we have are noble, but they are not yet enough to ensure the peaceful exploration of space in the years to come. Let us think for a moment about the Outer Space Treaty, one of the foundational agreements for the peaceful use of space signed by almost every nation with a space program. It states that outer space is not subject to national appropriation by claim of sovereignty, by means of use or occupation, or by any other means. No one can own the moon. But what do these words mean in a time when an increasing number of nations dream of setting up permanent bases of mining the lunar soil for its resources. If you set up a base on a planet or a moon, it certainly sounds like you are staking a claim to at least a small part of it. Claiming its resources certainly feels like appropriation. The United States has created the Artemis Accords, an agreement signed by 23 countries, which attempts to get around this by having its signatories legally state that they are not appropriating any of the resources they take from the moon. But other nations claim that this is just a game of words, a new version of an old story from Earth. The enclosure movement of Britain in the 18th century, when common land that belonged to everyone was slowly fenced off and claimed as private property. Depending on which legal interpretation is carried out in the end, there is a risk that any nation that attempts to claim resources from the moon might be in breach of international law. But clearly, this is not slowing anyone down. And consider too, the article in the treaty about space being a place for peaceful purposes. No nuclear weapons or other weapons of mass destruction are allowed in space. But this applies only to the great weapons, which leaves a lot of quiet room for weapons of middling destruction or lower. And such ideas are being explored. In 2003, 40 years after the Outer Space Treaty was signed, the US Air Force proposed an idea of placing 20-foot-long tungsten rods into orbit. These rods could be fired from space, falling at 10 times the speed of sound, hitting with the force of a small tactical nuke, but without the radiation. They would be almost impossible to detect and impossible to defend against. Fortunately, it was the idea that was dropped, not the rods, as it was deemed too expensive. But it was not dropped because it encroached on international law. As our civilization becomes more and more reliant on satellites for communication, for banking, for navigation, these silent helpers in the sky are increasingly becoming a point of vulnerability. Various nations are developing anti-satellite missiles or defenses against them to threaten the interests of others and to defend their own. This is a complex issue, one that carries unexpected dangers. A conflict of this kind in space is not as simple as one on Earth. When Russia tested one such missile on a defunct satellite of its own, it set thousands of pieces of debris hurtling into orbit. Some of these pieces could remain in space for years, and if they collide with other debris or other satellites, those in turn could shatter, creating a cascade effect, a chain reaction known as the Kessler syndrome. If such a conflict became widespread, it could be an end to the use of satellites for everyone. It could create a shroud of our own making around the Earth, a prison of fast-moving shrapnel that would make it impossible for us to leave our own world for generations. Interestingly, Russia and China have pushed for a treaty that would ban all weapons in space of any kind. But this has been stonewalled by the United States, which favors an approach laid out by one of its former presidents: speak softly and carry a big stick. And to add to the complexity of the situation, arguably some kind of force in space might actually be necessary. Beyond the actions of nations in January of 2018, a US company called Swarm was denied permission to launch 4 satellites. So Swarm went to India and launched them anyway without government approval. There were legal ramifications, a fine of $900,000. But it sets a concerning precedent. As space becomes more available for companies with large wallets and few scruples, it may one day become profitable to participate in illegal space ventures. Some degree of policing with some degree of force to back it up might become necessary to protect the interests of legitimate or scientific spacefarers. Sadly, there is a perceived preference from countries on all sides toward rules that promote freedom for their own actions while limiting the activities of others. And yet, space needs greater global regulation. If the nations of the world cannot agree on some kind of framework for the journey ahead, there is a risk that space exploration becomes a wild west rife with conflict, with the more noble aim of scientific advancement left by the wayside. This would be a great waste. With a little extra work, international law could become robust enough to prevent this. What has been agreed so far shows promise. One treaty, known as the Moon Treaty, lays out the environment of the moon as the common heritage of humankind, to be used only for peaceful purposes and only to be exploited with the careful agreement of an international regulatory regime. But not many nations have signed up to this treaty. None of the nations that have their own launch capabilities, the United States, Russia, or China, have signed it, which leaves this treaty largely ineffectual. So far, there has been no agreement on what this regime would look like, nor what the common heritage of mankind actually means. If space is going to be a safe place for future generations, this needs to change. More discussion needs to happen. Groups that send rockets into space need to keep track of them. Ultimately, the nations of the so-called civilized world need to come to more agreement on these issues. At the end of the day, we do not want to live in a world where we have mystery rockets crashing into the moon. We want to live in a world where space is appreciated for its alien beauty, where its dangers and mechanisms are purely natural and understood. A world where the moons and planets out there can be explored peacefully and fairly, rather than fought over and ultimately destroyed. Maybe, as a people, we need to grow up, not just technologically, but civilly too. Humanity has always loved new frontiers. In the 16th century, after Christopher Columbus first sailed to America, thousands of Europeans embarked on a perilous 6-month voyage across dangerous oceans to follow him. When they arrived, they knew that none of the comforts of their old lives would be waiting for them. They would have to farm, build shelters, and work hard just to survive. Many did not make it, either dying in the crossing or in the years after their arrival. But it did not stop more from coming. It could not. The call of the new frontier was too strong. Fast forward to the 21st century, and before us lies a new frontier space. Despite its beauty, it is the most hostile environment imaginable. Space will burn you. It will freeze you. Its radiation will kill you. The changing gravity will crush you or waste you away. Not even breathable air can be taken for granted. And yet, this frontier is calling to us. Perhaps it highlights something deep within human nature, that we would strive to go to such a desolate place. Maybe we relish the challenge. There is something that speaks to certain souls about going somewhere hostile and deadly and building something warm and safe there. Or maybe it is curiosity. There is so much to learn about the universe around us. And while looking at photographs and measuring conditions through instruments is interesting, there is nothing quite like experiencing a place, a phenomenon, a wonder of the universe firsthand. And so, humanity's sights are set on the other planets in our solar system. Mars might have humans walking on it as early as 2033. But it begins with the moon. The Artemis mission intends to get humans back to the moon by 2020. And in doing so, it will develop new technology and explore technical frontiers currently uncharted. The expertise gained from this enterprise will enable scientists to create spaceships capable of carrying human life to the wider solar system. It begins with the moon, and it begins with a craft named Orion. Its journey to the moon and back started at Launch Complex 39B at the Kennedy Space Center in Florida. The atmosphere there was tense but exciting. This was an important mission. It had been nearly 50 years since the end of the last space race. But just like that previous one, America is not the only one trying to get back to the moon's surface. The Chinese National Space Administration landed a rover on the far side of the moon in 2019, and they have recently developed a rocket that could potentially carry a human to the moon in the 2030s. NASA is nothing if not competitive. They hope to be the first ones back. For that to happen, Orion's mission would need to go well. The journey was planned to be a complex retrograde orbit, meaning traveling in the opposite direction to the moon's own orbit of the Earth. It would swing around the moon 3 times, 2 of them as close flybys. But this was no mere attempt at threading a celestial needle. More than just flying accurately, Orion would be testing the various onboard systems needed to support human life on such a journey. Many pieces had to be working perfectly. A single failure could be fatal for anyone on board. Of course, this first Orion mission was not carrying human passengers. That would be for a later mission, Artemis II. That said, there were passengers of a different sort. Inside the craft sat Commander Munikin Campos, a mannequin dummy filled with radiation sensors designed to record the levels of cosmic exposure that astronauts might experience. The name is a reference to an electrical engineer who helped save the Apollo 13 mission. Munikin was accompanied by two other mannequins built to represent different body types and genders, as female astronauts will be heading into space as part of later Artemis missions. It is important to see how space travel affects them specifically. The clothes these mannequins wear and Orion itself would need to protect them from cosmic radiation. Most agencies say that 50 millisieverts is the maximum safe amount of radiation a person can be exposed to in a year. On the moon, levels can get as high as 380. If NASA cannot get these exposure levels down, it will pose serious health risks for any future astronauts. Orion launched. This was the maiden voyage for both the craft and the rocket carrying it, the Super Heavy Lift Space Launch System. It is NASA's tallest and most powerful rocket to date, and currently the most powerful in the world. As it lifted off, the power was visible, tangible, even through a video screen. The first phase of the flight had begun. It would take 4 days to get to the moon, but NASA had no intention of wasting the time. On the very first day, they started to test the onboard systems. And surprisingly, this meant it was time to activate Alexa. Yes, that Alexa. It was on board as part of a collaboration with several companies, a suite of video conferencing and voice command technology. Technicians on Earth were able to call Orion and speak to Alexa, getting her to access information on the ship's telemetry and flight status. It is an intriguing use of the technology, a small glimpse of a future where, just like in science fiction, perhaps all of a spaceship's controls will be voice-activated. Light and silence drift together somewhere beyond. On the third day of Orion's quiet journey, once its course had been gently adjusted and it was well on its way toward the moon, the spacecraft performed a visual examination of itself. There was always the faint, whisper-thin risk of micrometeors, tiny grains of cosmic dust traveling at incredible speeds, hitting Orion's surface. And so, the craft took photographs of its own skin, allowing the teams on Earth to confirm the extent of any damage from this potential cosmic threat. It was a quiet reminder of one of the many dangers Orion would have to face. Fortunately, it seemed that any impacts had been minimal. In those first few days of travel, Orion also took images of the planet Earth, watching it shrink in the distance, a blue and white marble receding into the great black emptiness. And it started looking ahead toward the moon. The first lunar flyby was an important one. Orion would be traveling over sites visited by its predecessors, a silent pilgrimage to places like Tranquility Base, where Apollo 11 had landed, or the sites of Apollo 12 and 14. Traveling close to the lunar surface would be a good dry run, excellent practice for any future missions that would need to drop off cargo or people. But it also demonstrated one of the most important and repeatedly tested aspects of Orion's flight, its autonomy. For 15 minutes, as it passed behind the moon, the great mass of that silent world would block out all communication with Earth. NASA is deeply concerned with the safety of its astronauts, and so they have worked hard to build backup systems into Orion. But what would happen if the craft ever lost contact with Earth and had to navigate on its own? You cannot simply access Google Maps when you are traveling at over 8,000 kilometers an hour, more than 370,000 kilometers from home. Like the sailors who traveled across the vast unknown seas in ancient times, Orion would need a compass to help it find its way. And its method for doing this was, in fact, very much like those sailors. Orion can navigate by using the stars. The spacecraft is equipped with an optical navigation camera designed to be able to use the position of the distant glittering stars to track its own position, its orientation, and its motion in space at any time. By comparing what it sees with the digital star maps stored in its memory, it can always know where it is and where it is going. At numerous points on this long journey, scientists tested these systems, making sure this capability worked perfectly and would not be jeopardized by anything space had to throw at it, such as the warping effects of the sun's heat on its instruments. Fortunately, these systems all worked perfectly. As it passed through that zone of radio silence, Orion was able to maintain its sense of position and kept going in the correct direction. And when it passed back around the other side of the moon, it easily re-established contact. And as it did so, it was able to record an incredible sight, an inverse of what we see here on Earth, an Earthrise. Then it was time for more tests, including one of my favorites, the sloshing test. The way liquids move is complicated. Being able to predict how something like engine fuel will shift and flow during acceleration requires advanced computer models even here on Earth. But once you add to that the complexity of variable levels of gravity, it almost becomes easier to simply go up to space and see what happens. NASA was keenly interested in how much and in what ways the fuel on board Orion would move under thrust. This is known as sloshing. Understanding this would provide valuable data that could be used to predict how much of Orion's fuel would be needed to perform various maneuvers in space. Over the course of the next 2 weeks, Orion performed its delicate lunar orbits. During these complicated maneuvers, its thrusters were tested intensely. It takes a quiet mathematical precision to dance along the line between crashing into the surface of the moon and flying off into the deep of space. Without thrusters that performed exactly as needed, when needed, Orion would not have enough fuel to complete its trip, even with the extra supplies it carried. As it happened, the craft performed more efficiently than expected. Its thruster burns were exactly what NASA had hoped for. It was able to do its second lunar flyby, passing as close as 130 kilometers from the moon's surface. While many things went well, there were difficulties too. On day 8, for reasons that remain unclear, Orion dropped out of communication with Earth for 47 minutes. On day 19, power temporarily dropped out to the ship's heaters and propulsion systems. Fortunately, in both cases, NASA was able to get these systems up and running again. The second stage of its journey was now complete. The final stage, re-entry, was all that remained. Could Orion survive its fiery return to Earth's atmosphere? To make the process easier, only the crew module, the part of the craft that would one day hold the astronauts, would attempt to come home. This module detached itself from the rest of Orion and dropped toward the planet. To ease its way into the atmosphere, it performed a skipping maneuver similar to the way you might skim a flat stone across a body of water. This dip and bounce technique slowed its speed, allowing it to try to land at its desired location with greater precision. Still, the temperatures got so hot during re-entry that the friction turned the air around the capsule into a glowing plasma. Orion dropped out of radio contact one last time. NASA had expected this, but they still had to wait with bated breath as Orion's autonomous systems worked to stabilize its entry. As its new heat-resistant exterior plating tried to protect its silent passengers within. At just under 3,000 meters above the sea, traveling at over 200 kilometers per hour, Orion's parachutes began to deploy. First, 3 smaller ones to remove the bay doors. Next, 2 drogue parachutes intended to begin slowing the capsule's arrival. And a minute later, the main parachutes. Together, these great sheets of fabric slowed Orion's descent to the point where a human on board could have survived it. On the 11th of December, Orion splashed down in the Pacific Ocean, activating a wide array of signal beacons calling for someone to pick it up. It was the USS Portland that came to collect it. Scientists waited for a couple of hours while the outer casing cooled. This also allowed them to perform even more tests, this time on how the salt water of the sea affected Orion's various systems and an evaluation of how well it had resisted the heat of re-entry. The initial results looked positive. The passengers within had not been cooked by the 2,800 degrees Celsius temperatures. We are still waiting for the final data from the radiation sensors on the mannequins themselves. But they had done it. They had run their race. The data this first Artemis mission had generated would be instrumental in allowing astronauts to stand on the surfaces of worlds other than our own once again. Humanity's quest to reach ever further frontiers continues. For Orion, its part in this ever-developing journey was complete. The Apollo program. The name itself is iconic, a part of our shared scientific history. To this day, we have never beaten some of the landmarks set by those missions. It is still the only program to get a human being beyond a low Earth orbit. And as new efforts are being made to return people to the moon, it seems a good idea to look back at that first giant leap to visit our closest neighbor. What drove humanity to visit the moon in the first place? And what did we learn once we were there? The program consisted of 12 crewed flights and over a dozen uncrewed ones. There were challenges, breakthroughs, triumphs, and tragedies. This is the story of the first steps in getting a human on the moon. The story of the Apollo program. NASA's Apollo program was, and still is, the single largest research and development program ever conducted by a nation during peacetime. At its peak, NASA was employing 400,000 people, drawing on the support of 20,000 different companies and universities. It represented more than 4% of the entire US government's budget. Given that today NASA only represents about half of 1%, this raises an important question. Why was the United States so focused on achieving this goal? To understand, we must let our thoughts drift back to the context that led to the program's creation. And that begins with understanding the Cold War. In the aftermath of the Second World War, tensions began to rise between the two global superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union. Each wanted to prove that their nation, their way of life was superior. This was more than a simple rivalry. Due to deep political differences, each saw the success of the other as a threat to its very existence. America was worried that if the Soviet Union did too well, it could be the end of capitalism and democracy. The USSR was concerned that if it did not do better than America, it could spell the end of the communist dream. Each side viewed the other with deep suspicion, and each was adamant that it would not be left behind. And so it was with great alarm to the American people that on the 4th of October 1957, the USSR successfully launched the first ever artificial satellite to orbit the Earth, Sputnik 1. It weighed 83 kilograms, 8 times the size of any satellite the US was considering launching. And it went around the Earth 1,440 times during the 3 months it remained in orbit. By sending signals to and from it, Soviet scientists were able to acquire information about the density of the Earth's upper atmosphere. The rocket that launched Sputnik was capable of producing 4.4 million newtons of thrust. American rockets, by comparison, could only produce about 1/7 of that. This breakthrough unsettled the American people for 2 reasons. Firstly, in an era where the threat of nuclear war was never far away, knowing that an enemy nation had access to such powerful rockets made Americans feel vulnerable. It seemed perfectly possible that such rockets could carry nuclear payloads instead of scientific ones. A valid concern, as that rocket was in fact designed with a nuclear payload in mind. But more than that, Americans were worried that the Soviet Union was advancing further than them in science and technology. To reassure the people, the then unelected President Kennedy ran for office on a promise that he would ensure American supremacy in space. When he was successfully elected, he began looking at ways to keep this promise and was shocked when he realized how much the whole thing would cost. However, when the USSR completed another space landmark on April 12, 1961, by getting the first human into space, President Kennedy began to ask his researchers what they could do to match or exceed the Soviet progress. The answer came back just 8 days later. If they wanted to beat the Soviet Union, who were already so far ahead, they would need to aim for something that was currently outside of both nations' capabilities. The target suggested was an internationally lofty one designed to impress the world. NASA would put a man on the moon. The clouds keep turning slow and endless. This challenge, this quiet decision to reach for the moon, would require immense improvements to America's existing rocket technology. They would need to produce 50 times as much force to lift all the necessary equipment to get a person to the moon and back. NASA would also require a significantly higher budget, which was swiftly approved. In 1961, the agency was given $744 million for its various projects. Just a few years later, as the budgetary requirements ramped up, NASA was receiving over $5 billion per year. With these new funds, NASA began to expand its operations. It built new launch sites and mission control centers, hired new staff, and purchased new research equipment like giant vacuum chambers capable of nearly simulating the perfect emptiness of space. The agency had already been considering how to get a person to the moon in early 1960. But with this new infusion of resources and this new political urgency, they began to consider the problem much more seriously. There were various plans drawn up. Should they build one single giant rocket that would fly straight to the moon and back again, a plan called direct ascent? Or maybe An Earth orbit rendezvous would be a better option where, over the course of up to 15 separate rocket launches, various spacecraft parts could be carried up to and assembled in space. There were difficulties with both of these plans. A rocket flying straight to the moon and back would be extremely heavy. It would have to carry enough fuel to escape both the Earth's and the moon's gravity, and this much extra weight was even further beyond the USA's current rocket capabilities. The second idea to build a rocket in space was also problematic. It would get around the lift issue, as carrying only a part of a spacecraft at a time would be much lighter for each individual rocket. But launching so many rockets would massively increase the overall cost and complexity of the project. And assembling a spacecraft in the weightlessness of space would be no easy feat either. Finally, NASA decided on a plan that could use the best elements of both ideas. Their idea was to create a rocket that would come apart in stages, a mission plan they called the Lunar Orbit Rendezvous. The main rocket would take two smaller modules out of Earth's orbit, a capsule-like command module, and another segment called the lunar module. These two modules would travel together to the moon. Once in lunar orbit, the lunar module, which was much smaller and lighter, would detach from the command module and would take the astronauts down to the surface. Once their work was done, it would take them back up again to rendezvous with the command module. Once all the astronauts and any collected samples were transferred back to the command module, the lunar module would be left behind, and the command module would travel alone back to Earth before finally splashing down in the ocean. It seems a little complex, but it was hoped to be the most economical model, both in terms of cost and in terms of the weight and thrust requirements. With this plan in place, NASA could begin construction and testing. They would need to create rockets that were significantly larger and more powerful than anything they had ever built before. They would need to put their own astronauts into space and thoroughly test each stage of the journey to ensure the success of the program. But they were underway. The Apollo program had begun. Like a great tree that grows from smaller roots, the Apollo program did not stand alone. Its achievements would not have been possible if it had not been for the important, smaller missions that ran before it and alongside it. It built on the understanding learned from those missions, expanded on their technology, and drew on the expertise of the people who worked on them. Now, we will examine two of those vital early programs, Project Mercury and Project Gemini, and investigate how they helped a fledgling NASA to gain a greater understanding of how to put a person on the moon. NASA as an institution has not been around forever. It was only created in 1958 in response to the Soviet Union launching the Sputnik satellite a year earlier. However, it is not accurate to say that NASA was completely new even then. When the US president signed off on its formation, He did it by combining several already existing programs and institutions. There was the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics, the US, Army's Ballistic Missile Agency, and the German scientists who had worked on ballistic missiles for Germany during the Second World War. Beyond that, the US Air Force had been working on a program which was also given to NASA along with some of their facilities. These, alongside other government projects, provided the foundation for NASA. However, amongst all of these, there was not yet a way to get a human into orbit. The closest was the X-15 program, an experimental aircraft that was able to skim the very edges of space. In the early Shutter 60s, it broke records by flying to a height of 105 kilometers and achieving speeds of over 6,000 kilometers per hour. A later version broke 7,200 kilometers per hour and holds the record to this day for the fastest crude-powered aircraft. However, while this was technically above the definition of space, this is really the limit of an airplane. Something more would need to be developed to get a human properly into orbit and ultimately to the moon. And so NASA began its first project to get a human into Space Project Mercury. Its mission was a continuation of that earlier Air Force program, and its objective was simple: to get a person into orbit and back safely, ideally before the Soviet Union did. This would not be an easy task. Riding a rocket into space meant an astronaut would need to deal with immense G-forces, intense vibrations, the risk of explosion from riding on what was basically a repurposed missile, and the threat of catastrophic burning up on re-entry. Scientists also worried about radiation once an astronaut left the protection of the atmosphere, and even micrometeors striking the ship. While some of these threats proved to be negligible, the odds of being hit by a meteor turned out to be very small. The rest were very real dangers. The rockets NASA used for Project Mercury were the Redstone rocket, which was later replaced by the Atlas rocket. Both of these were originally designed as missiles. The Redstone was a direct descendant of the German V-2 rocket developed for use in war. When the Second World War ended, America brought German scientists over and put them to work developing American weapons and technology. Wernher von Braun, a German scientist brought over in this way, became a chief engineer at NASA and was instrumental in helping to develop the rocket technology for Project Mercury and later for Apollo. The idea was for a launch vehicle to carry a small pod up to a height of 161 kilometers, shedding its boosters and unneeded sections along the way. The pod would then orbit the Earth, getting as high as 280 kilometers before using its own small boosters to re-enter the atmosphere after surviving the frictional heat of re-entry, which could get as hot as 1,600 degrees Celsius. Parachutes would open and slow the pod's landing in the ocean where it would be retrieved. Boosters would need to jettison at the correct time to keep the weight down. This did not always happen. They were trying out new ablative heat shields. Rather than completely preventing heat absorption, these shields absorbed a large amount of heat and then burned it off as a gas, carrying the excess heat away with it. Obviously, if you miscalculated how much heat shield you would need, your craft would run out and you would burn up. Redundancies would need to be built into the rocket in the event of a malfunction. While there was a human on board, a rocket-powered escape vehicle was built into the spacecraft, a kind of ejector seat. The whole process had to be thoroughly tested before they could try out a crewed mission. The first effort in August of 1959 did not go well. Due to an incorrectly installed power plug, the first Mercury Redstone rocket only got about 4 inches off the ground before dropping back down onto the landing pad. Future launches had mixed results. Von Braun ran 20 tests in all between 1959 and 61. Most of these tests were not crewed, except for a few where trained monkeys and chimpanzees occupied the pod. Von Braun wanted to be absolutely sure of success before allowing a human to go up in one of his rockets. While his caution was excellent scientific practice, it came at a price. In April of 1961, Russia beat America to the punch by successfully launching the cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin into orbit, making him the first man in space. Von Braun's first human launch came 1 month later with astronaut Alan Shepard, although this was still only a suborbital flight. The US was worried. Project Mercury ended up launching 6 human flights, all of which were successful. And although they did not get into space first, they learned incredibly important things about launching rockets, enduring space, and surviving re-entry. However, when NASA announced the Apollo program in 1960 with its intention to reach the moon, it became clear that far more knowledge would be needed. Mercury had seen its final mission put an astronaut in space for a day and a half, but a trip to the moon and back would take 8 days. Also, the plan to use the lunar orbit rendezvous method required them to perform perhaps the most difficult maneuver in space travel docking with another object in orbit. They had not even achieved this around Earth yet, let alone the moon. Astronauts would also need to practice doing spacewalks in case work on the outside of a spacecraft became necessary. And finally, more practice would be needed with re-entry techniques. On top of all that, the Soviet Union was ahead, and America needed to catch up. So while the Apollo team set to work developing its giant rockets and modules, these extra challenges were handed off to a support mission, a program to work out the details. The mission was given the name Project Gemini. Launching 12 missions between 1961 and 66, it built on the foundations of Project Mercury. The Gemini capsule was essentially a larger version of the one used on Mercury, now able to hold a crew of 2. The rocket used was a Titan II, another adapted military missile. Gemini also saw an expansion on the technology. The Mercury spacecraft could do little to redirect itself once it made it into orbit. If a space rendezvous was going to happen, this would need to change. The Gemini spacecraft was given its own maneuvering system to allow it to change its orbit and orient itself while in space. The craft was also developed to be able to support a crew for longer. By the launch of Gemini 5, astronauts were able to spend an entire week in space. In later flights, this time was extended to 14 days. 6 more days than would be required for a trip to the moon. While there was a lot of success with these missions, there were some scares too. Neil Armstrong flew on Gemini 8. The purpose of this mission was to meet up with and dock with an uncrewed target vehicle. The first part of the mission went smoothly. But while Armstrong and his co-pilot were still docked, they noticed that their ship had started to spin. This could be catastrophic. If the spinning ship hit their Gemini craft while they tried to undock it, could cause fatal damage. Furthermore, they were not sure why the craft was spinning. If a thruster was firing when it should not be, then it would be using up valuable fuel. Fuel that was needed to orient themselves for re-entry. The 2 astronauts worked quickly. By firing one of the opposing thrusters, they were able to slow the 2 crafts enough that they were able to get back into the Gemini craft and just about undock safely. They realized then that it had been one of their own craft's thrusters that had been stuck firing continuously. Both astronauts were close to passing out from the spinning, but they managed to fix the fault. Using the re-entry thrusters, Armstrong calmly got the craft back under control, stopping its tumble. He managed it with only 30% of his maneuvering fuel remaining. Moments like this reinforced the importance of being able to perform spacewalks. And so, Gemini also saw missions where astronauts practiced going outside of their spacecraft. Buzz Aldrin set the record for this, performing a 5.5-hour spacewalk, proving that with proper rests, work outside of a spacecraft was indeed possible. This also gave engineers ideas on ways they could make it easier, such as installing handholds at certain places on the craft. All in all, it was through the work of Gemini and Mercury that the foundation was laid. Thanks to the discoveries made on both of these programs, NASA was making strides in its objective to reach the moon. It also started to close the gap between itself and Russia. It would now be up to Apollo to take the final steps. The thought widens, becoming air, and so the stage was set. The foundations built through years of trial and error, of courage and caution, were now strong enough to hold the weight of a dream that had once seemed impossible. The final steps would be taken by Apollo, a name that would echo through history. a symbol of a time when humanity, for a brief, shining moment, reached out and touched another world. The dream shifts and softens, pulling away from the details of missions and machines to simply rest on the image of the moon itself as it hangs in the night sky. It is the same moon that the astronauts of Apollo saw, the same moon that the little moon sniper now rests upon, tilted and silent. It is the same moon that received the hard impact of the lunar coffin and the mysterious scar of the lost rocket booster. It is the keeper of all these stories, these quiet successes and loud failures. It continues its slow ancient dance, the same dance that pulls at our oceans, that causes the tides to rise and fall in a rhythm that will soon reach its peak, testing the shores we have built. The same dance that nourishes the mangroves, a quiet reminder that even in its most powerful forces, nature holds a balance of creation and destruction. We are a part of that rhythm, whether we are building seawalls to hold back the water or building rockets to escape the pull of the earth. The dream recalls the silent journey of Orion, its mannequin passengers patiently measuring the invisible dangers of the cosmos, preparing the way for a human return. It carries with it all the lessons of the past, the triumphs of Apollo, the mistakes of the Cold War, the growing awareness that the heavens are not an empty frontier, but a delicate environment that we must learn to care for. All these journeys, from the first small steps of Mercury and Gemini to the giant leaps of Apollo, to the precise touch of the moon sniper, are threads in a single unfolding story. It is a story of curiosity, of rivalry, of incredible ingenuity, and of a persistent, quiet hope. It is the story of looking up at that silver light in the sky and dreaming of what might be possible. And now, as our own journey through this story comes to a gentle close, we let these images drift. The tiny resilient craft, the rising tides, the journey of the stars. Let them become a part of the quiet landscape of your own rest. A soft current carrying you toward the deep, silent frontier of your own dreams. The story fades into the quiet of the night, and all that remains is the slow, steady rhythm of your breath.